Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event. It is the next event on our series on the politics of the Sochi Olympics. I would remind everyone that we are being filmed. This is on the record. It will be put on the Harriman Institute website. And so if you participate in the discussion afterwards, please do keep in mind that your comments will be broadcast on the web. The theme for tonight's meeting is the global internet politics of the post-Snowden era in Russia, what's happening in Russia. And we know that it's very much tied to the Sochi Olympics question because of articles that, in particular, one of our speakers tonight has been writing for The Guardian about what exactly has been happening with the Russian security services keeping tabs on people who are at the Sochi Olympics. But we have two speakers tonight, and so let me introduce each of them in turn. First, we have Misha Glenny, who is an award-winning writer and broadcaster and journalist whose new book called Dark Market, Cyber Thieves, Cyber Cops, and You is now being published in over 20 editions around the world. He's a former BBC Central Europe correspondent. He's done a lot of coverage throughout the Eastern European space, including in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. He's written for most major publications in Europe, the United States, and Japan. And his previous book was called McMafia: Journey Through the Global Criminal Underworld. And that also was translated into over 30 languages. He has been a visiting professor at the Harriman Institute, so it's wonderful to welcome him back. His students have loved him. And he is currently researching a book on crime and corruption in Brazil. So he's moving from the Sochi Olympics to a future set of Olympics. The second speaker for tonight is Andrei Soldatov, who is an investigative journalist and an editor of Agentura.ru, which is an information hub that focuses on intelligence and on the security services in Russia. He covered the siege of the theater in Moscow and of the hostage crisis in Beslan. He's written for a long time on terrorist issues as well as intelligence issues. He has given comments on Radio Free Europe, Viedomosti, the BBC. And in 2010, he was the co-author with Irina Baragan of a book called The New Nobility, The Restoration of Russia's Security State and the Enduring Legacy of the KGB. So it is our real pleasure to have both of them conversing with us tonight. And after they have a conversation with each other, we will open up the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. So I'm Misha, this is Andrei. And we've had a little discussion about how we would conduct this session. Andrei is much better equipped to talk about all the specific issues around Sochi, and so I'm going to be an interlocutor to start with. And once we've heard what he's got to say and how he assesses what's going on in Sochi, both in terms of the politics, in terms of the security policy, and in terms of cyber, we're going to broaden it out a little and see what implications this, but also Snowden, has had for Russia and for the politics of the internet around the world, which I've been looking at more closely. But also, everything that is going on around Sochi at the moment is linked up to a really intensifying problematic relationship between the United States and Russia in particular, but also because of Ukraine, between the European Union and Russia as well, with several neuralgic points, the Middle East being one of them, Ukraine being another, energy policy being another. And it's quite possible that in the course of our discussion, we'll be touching on all of these issues before we hand it over to the floor. And then I hope that because of the nature of the way that we're going to conduct this, that we will have more of a discussion rather than a strict question and answer, but it's obviously entirely up to you what you want to do. So I'm going to start off by asking Andrei, who was last in Sochi about 3 weeks ago, was it, yeah, Andrei? That's right. What exactly he found there, what his assessment of the politics of Sochi is, and in particular the security politics and how this impacts on on cyber and related issues. So, Andrei.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Well, almost a year ago, in March of the last year, we sat with Citizen Lab in Toronto and Privacy International in London, and thought that maybe it's a good idea to try to look into what kind of security and surveillance measures might be deployed in Sochi by the Russian secret services, given the record of the Russian secret services, and given the fact that almost everywhere, any country which hosted Olympics tried to use Olympics as a test ground for surveillance technologies. It happened in Toronto, in Vancouver, in London, in Beijing. So it's quite a common thing. And given the fact that the Russian secret services are quite well, they have their own records, and in terms of surveillance technologies, some of surveillance technologies produced by the Russian companies are surprisingly the best in the world, like, for example, the speaker recognition technologies. And given the fact that Russian ideas of telecommunication interception are also very intrusive, and before, well, obviously before Snowden revelations, I thought that we have the most intrusive system of telecommunication interception in the world. So that was the main idea of investigating Russian security measures deployed in Sochi area. So what we found out? First of all, we found out that since 2010, it was decided by the FSB to significantly update the Russian system of telecommunication interception, which is called SORM. SORM is a system of operative research measures, and this system was designed in the late 1980s, back in the Soviet times. It was constantly updated ever since, but the foundations of these systems lay in the Soviet past. That's why in this system, from the beginning, there was no space, no room for warrant. And when this system was first deployed in the early 1990s, while the Russian legislation requires the Russian secret services to put into the system the warrant, but actually it's still very, it looks very strange. Like the FSB operative he's actually required to get the warrant from the court, but he has no right to show this warrant to anyone. And the operator, the internet service provider, has no right to require this warrant, and because he has no security clearance. And even technically, the systems of lawful interception in the West and in Russia are designed completely, they're absolutely different. We have only one line of communications, and all things are done by the FSB operative. And in the West, you have two lines. So the first line is used to send the request to the operator when the interception is conducted by the operator, and the results of interception sent back to the law enforcement agency. And so we found out that even this intrusive system, which was, as I said, very invasive from the beginning, was significantly updated for Sochi. And in one of the documents we discovered, it was stationed quite clearly that this system should be updated to deal with visitors. So it's not about terrorists, it's about visitors to the Olympics. We also found out that in terms of security measures in Sochi, the Russian authorities wanted to actually to put all they have to put to secure the area. As a result, we got the record number of CCTV cameras. We have 11,000 CCTV cameras in the area of Sochi. And it was claimed quite proudly that this is a record number, and no games before ever seen such a number of CCTV cameras. We also got drones and blimps, surveillance drones, and these things we never seen before, because in London, the British authorities wanted to use drones, but because of public outcry, eventually they decided just to drop silently this idea, and drones were never used. We also got things which absolutely unprecedented, and I think this kind of measures might be then picked up by other countries. like we got this spectator pass thing. What does it mean? It means that if you want to buy a ticket, first you should be cleared by the FSB. So you need to get the spectator pass. And to get the spectator pass, you should be vetted by the FSB. So actually, the buying of tickets, it's not your decision. It's a privilege that might be granted by the FSB or might be not granted. And we already had examples that some people were not allowed to buy the tickets because they were not allowed to get this spectator pass. And we also found out that some strange things happened, like, for example, sonars to identify hostile submarines were deployed in the area. And well, maybe it's indication that so many Russian agencies wanted to get some bases to install something in the area of Sochi, and in this case, the military was keen to get something to show to Putin that they also took part in securing the area of Sochi. But the most amazing thing is a collection of metadata. This was made known in November, and the idea, it was a decree signed by Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. The idea is to build a special database and to collect metadata on all participants of the games, including athletes, judges, journalists mentioned three times in the document, as foreign journalists, local journalists, and photographers. So actually, you should be, well, it was made sure that all journalists would be under control. And this data would be stored for 3 years. So the FSB would have access to all this metadata for 3 years, and well, I think it's quite a remarkable thing. Certainly, you can justify some of these measures by closeness of Sochi to the North Caucasus. You might say that because well, Dagestan is not very far from Sochi, it's only 300 miles, and Abkhazia is just a few kilometers from Sochi. And given how many terrorist attacks we got only in December, so all the Russian authorities try to justify all these measures because they need to prevent a terrorist attack. The problem is that not all of these surveillance measures are intended to prevent a terrorist attack. And it's quite clear. For example, drones. They're absolutely useless to identify and detect suicide bomber. They're just useless. They might be used to identify signs of mass gathering of people and to identify protest or riots. But they're useless against suicide bomber. The same thing goes with metadata collection. I don't quite understand how metadata collection might help to prevent a suicide bombing attack if we are talking about athletes, journalists, and judges. And the same thing goes with communication interception, with the SORM system. What struck me that many of these documents were published. They are not confidential. And I think that might be this was done consciously. Because the idea, and it's already quite clear in Sochi, according to reports that we got from Wall Street Journal quite recently, that what we have two things. We have, on the one hand, some groups of visitors, we might say, activists and journalists. So the authorities made sure that these groups of people got a message from the authorities that you would be spied on. So think twice about what you are intended to do in Sochi if you want to cover the protest or if you want to contact, well, local activists. You should know that all your contacts, all your sources would be exposed to the Russian secret services. On the other hand, ordinary visitors, ordinary tourists, they didn't spot anything special. They even didn't see people in uniform. They didn't see people armed. They see policemen and FSB people, mostly plain clothes, so they don't have it. They don't have weapons with them. And I think it's also made consciously because the idea is to to say these people that, but forget about the North Caucasus. We are in central Russia. There is not such a problem as security, and you don't need to think about this. So that's the basic thing about security and surveillance measures in Sochi. I think the best and the most interesting thing about it is that it's not very clear how sophisticated all these measures in terms of detecting a real terrorists and how they're sophisticated in analyzing data. And well, we know that with Russian secret services, they still have some problems with analyzing databases. But it's already clear we are very good. We are very good at sending a message, and we are very good at imposing self-censorship on people who might get to the Olympics to organize protests or to journalists. And I think in this area, the tactics used by the Russian secret services is very effective.
Andrei, who was in charge overall charge of the security operations in Sochi?
The FSB was put in charge in 2010, but what was quite interesting to me is we all expected that the head of the counterterrorism department would be responsible for securing the Olympics. Instead, the FSB chose the main spy hunter, the chief of the counterintelligence department. His name is Soldatov. And, well, the problem with this choice is, we might say this general is very, well, professional. He's very smart, but he has this mentality. He spent his entire career in hunting down foreign spies. So that's why when we got these remarks from the United States that, well, the cooperation between Russia and the United States in terms of providing security for Sochi is not very good. I think it's all might be explained by the mentality of these people, because by their nature they're suspicious of spies, and they were trained to detect CIA spies, and now they are proposed some help from these very people. So I don't think we should expect from them any level of trust or will to cooperate.
Let's explore a bit the whole SORM program and the introduction of SORM 3, the latest version, as it were. Can you explain to people here, in principle, how that operates and what it means for people who are using the internet or internet-based communications in Russia?
Well, the SORM 3 is meant to combine all practices, all systems of communication interception. So it's not only about phone eavesdropping, it's also about emails, it's about activities on social networks, it's even about how to get data from social networks which are hosted on Russian soil, like Vkontakte, for example. It's also about Wi-Fi networks, and we should remember one thing, that some of the systems in Russia were specifically made more vulnerable. And that happened with public Wi-Fi. In 2011, the FSB and Russian authorities in general required the Western suppliers of telecommunication equipment to public Wi-Fi to disable some of the encryption functions. And it was done specifically to give the FSB more easy access to networks. And the idea for the FSB is to have all communications on Russian soil absolutely transparent for interception.
So, because until now, when we've been looking at mechanisms of control over internet communications around the world, China has often been cited as the most advanced, with its Great Firewall, amongst other things, which is designed to filter out what is referred to as cultural contamination. But in fact, we're beginning to see in Russia actually a system which is perhaps more extensive than the Chinese system. Have you been able to compare the two at all in terms of their effectiveness? And in particular, what it seems to me that the Russians are doing is focusing on the internet service providers, on the ISPs.
Yeah.
And this puts them in a very, very difficult position, both commercially and in terms of trust with their subscribers. So how does that work with the relationship with the ISPs? And
well, we actually experienced some problems with ISP, mostly caused by new technologies. I remember that 2 years ago I met some people very close to the FSB, and they told me that the security services in Russia now had this problem of how to intercept something like Skype call, which you can take on your TV now, on your laptop, smartphone, and in this case, you might see that your call might goes from so many networks, and would be not necessarily your network that you use in your office. And they told me that the traditional means of SORM are quite useless to intercept these kind of things. That's why, but then we got internet filtering system in Russia in November of 2012. And then the idea was to use DPI to filter something, deep packet inspection. It's a very sophisticated technology which allows the ISPs to analyze traffic and to sometimes to mitigate some traffic. The problem with this technology is that sometimes this technology might be used not only for filtering but also for interception. And when the FSB people found out that DPI would be installed on nationwide basis in Russia, they started talking about how to combine SORM and DPI. Legally, it's very questionable because DPI managed by ISP people, by ISP staff, and SORM is managed by the FSB operative. But I was told that in Siberia and some other regions, they already tried to combine these two boxes in one, and they tried to find a solution how to intercept all these calls, and I was told that they are quite successful.
Okay, so let's pull back a little now and look at the overall context where this is going on, and of course the context has been changed so fundamentally by Snowden, and by the fact that clearly the United States is up to all sorts of things as well. They have a different policy in terms of how they want to see the internet regulated around the world. And behind the scenes, in various fora, various bodies, there have been some rather fractious negotiations between the major players, which is not just China, Russia, and the United States. It's also the various countries of the European Union, but also India and Brazil are playing a very significant role in this as well. How has Russia interpreted the whole Snowden business? Of course, they're hosting Snowden now. What do they see as Snowden's value for them, and how do they see that it changes their relations in terms of internet regulation with the rest of the world? You've got thoughts on those, and then we'll start.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to remember that just a few months before Snowden turned up at Sheremetyevo airport, Russian efforts to change global governance and the rules on the internet spectacularly failed in December at ITU meeting, International Telecommunication Union. And then the idea of the Foreign Ministry of Russia was to try to present new ideas and to shift powers from American-based institutions to UN level.
I think I'll just explain here now that the ITU has been regulating global telecommunications since the 1860s, as it happens. It has never, until the Dubai summit in 2012, it has always, up until that point, including during the First and Second World Wars, it has always come to agreement by consensus of all its members on the regulation of telecommunications. And with the internet, this has now begun to fracture. And in particular, Russia, supported with moderate enthusiasm by China, or actually genuine enthusiasm by China, but also by India and latterly Brazil.
And by African states. Actually, more than, I think, 80 countries actually voted for the Russian proposals, but not Europe and not Anglo-Saxon countries.
So the context is that the people who actually control most of the nuts and bolts of the internet are private or semi-private organizations, and most of them are based here in the United States. And so there is, you know, they have their hands on the tap, as it were, of internet control. And this, of course, for the Russians and the Chinese, is a very galling state of affairs. So that's the context within which the Dubai meeting in 2012 of the ITU took place, and the Russians failed to push through.
Yeah, and the main idea of Russian proposals was to install the ideas of national sovereignty on the internet, and actually to create borders on the internet and to give the government more powers to control what's going on the internet, including, and I think this idea was debated since 2011 maybe, to somehow to find a way to pressure global platforms like Google, Facebook, Twitter to have their servers hosted on Russian soil. But, as I said, they failed mostly because they were not supported by Europe and by Anglo-Saxon countries. And when we got Snowden, and Snowden changed everything, because some Russian officials, they seized this opportunity to use Snowden's revelation as the main argument to say, you see, personal data of Russian citizens, they made available to American spy agencies. We need to do something to protect Russian interests and Russian citizens' personal data. And to protect personal data of Russians, we need to push global services, and first of all Google, and to force them to host their service on Russian soil. That was the idea, and this idea is debated maybe since March of the last year. And the problem also that it's in some way it coincided with the crucial development that we got because of the internet filtering system. The internet filtering system, as I said, was introduced in November 2012, but since then the Russian authorities were so straightforward in pressuring and blocking things on the internet that quite naturally many of global platforms became frightened that the whole services might be blocked in Russia, because it already happened briefly. The Facebook was temporarily blocked for a day, as far as I remember. YouTube was blocked in some regions of Russia for some periods of time. The same thing happened with Twitter, and as a result, these platforms became much more cooperative with the Russian authorities. And already by March of the last year, it took Russian authorities 3 or 4 hours to convince Facebook, Twitter, and Google to remove something on the platforms, and with no warrant, I would say, with no court decision, just sending a message. And so they were, in some way, they were provoked by the success they experienced. They already saw that they can just push on these global platforms, and well, they would just comply with their requests. So why not to try with the same approach with personal data and with servers? And we got Snowden, and we tried to use these things ever since.
So, and the context within which this is taking place, this is something that's been going on in terms of discussion about internet control for several years before Snowden happened. And it's not just Russia. Both India and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, for example, were insistent on BlackBerry placing servers inside their countries, because what was happening with the BlackBerry messaging service is that if you were, say, someone in Dubai and you were sending an encrypted message to a friend of yours in Abu Dhabi, that would go via a server in Western Canada, which we now know had a back door in it, so it would go from Dubai to Abu Dhabi via Canada, and the Americans and the Canadians could read it. So the reason why, or at least one of the reasons it's posited why the Arab Emirates were so keen on BlackBerry putting their servers inside their country was not so much that they could read what's going on between their citizens, although of course they're very interested about that as well, but because they could stop the Americans reading what's going on between their citizens. And this is something that was picked up on very quickly around the world. Now, the extent of the Snowden revelations, there's no question that they go much further than people imagined. But the idea that the Germans, for example, didn't know that there was some traffic monitoring going on by the United States, or indeed that the Germans were up to stuff themselves, which they have been for quite a long time, is slightly preposterous. But what Snowden does is that it focuses a lot of public bodies on what the NSA has been up to, and it completely shifts the paradigm of debate. The country that I'm looking at most closely at the moment is Brazil, and there the revelations about listening into Dilma Rousseff's, the president's phone calls and her internet usage and so on, has done real damage to American interests in terms of how the internet is going to be regulated worldwide. For the Russians and for the Chinese, this was a huge opportunity. I don't know if you recall when the Snowden revelations took place, but they came out when he was in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is a significant part of this as well. 3 days before the summit meeting was due to take place between President Obama and President Xi Jinping in California. And the Obama administration, which goes to show you that they had absolutely no idea for all of the surveillance that they do. They had no idea of the oncoming train that was about to hit them, had telegraphed very clearly in advance that the top issue that Obama was going to discuss with Xi Jinping was China's relentless cyber espionage. And I'm waiting at some point from a translator or something like that, a first-hand description of Xi Jinping walking in and saying, "I gather you want to talk about cyber espionage. Please, let's talk." And I don't think it was entirely coincidental. I don't suppose Snowden necessarily knew this, but I don't think it's entirely coincidental that he pitches up in Hong Kong. And certainly the Russians, I think, and Andrei can talk to this, is that Snowden was a sort of gift horse that they couldn't, you know, they had to take him. He was just too, it was perfect.
Well, actually, it saved so many careers in the Russian foreign ministry, I think, especially these people who promoted the idea of changing the rules on the internet. And I remember a few months ago, I met a guy from the foreign ministry of Russia who told me, well, now we should compare, well, for us, Snowden is so important because look into how many victims of NSA espionage we have. The number of victims of NSA espionage might be comparable with the number of victims of Stalin purges. To be frank, I was quite surprised by this comparison, but well.
Yes. So Snowden turns up in Moscow, and of course, if you look at it both in terms of Assange and WikiLeaks and Snowden, the only position they can possibly take, particularly Snowden, once he's been given asylum for a year, and of course everything is going to become very interesting again when his asylum runs out, and perhaps you can speculate about that, Andrei. But once he's given asylum by Russia, of course his position has to be my enemy's enemy is my friend. And of course, Snowden is not in a position to start denouncing SORM 3 and all of these other technologies that the Russians are clearly as keen to introduce as the NSA is to listen to people all over the world. So what does that do? How are the Russians able to leverage this fact that they've got Snowden there? First of all, the issue of how much information do you think they've got out of him? Or is that pure speculation?
Yeah, I think it's pure speculation because, well, all reports about how many laptops was with actually Snowden brought to Moscow, even this fact is disputable and nobody knows for sure. And it's very unclear what kind of access he still have to his own information, and there are different versions, and Glenn Greenwald sometimes said that there is no access to Snowden, and sometimes it's too complicated. But I think the problem is I don't believe that Snowden was actually, well, debriefed by the FSB or foreign intelligence, and they extracted some information from him. But I do believe that maybe in some way, because he lives in a controlled environment, in a way, he's protected by these people. There are always speculation about threats to his life and that he might be killed by, I don't know, by CIA teams. And his Russian law, Anatoly Kucheryan, was quite insistent in telling these things about threats. And I think that, well, the problem is that when you have such a big amount of information, the question is about choice. What kind of stories would be published first? And we see, I think it's, we should think about it, why it happened. We see quite a shift in well, we started with something which has to do with public interest. We started with stories about how ordinary citizens, American citizens or European citizens, were spied on by NSA and GCHQ and some other agencies. But then the focus in some way shifted to clear espionage stories about Merkel and about some other officials. And to be frank, I don't quite understand why it happened, because I don't see any public interest in stories about bad security and for Merkel. I think.
But didn't you interpret it the way I interpreted it? Was that it would, because even though Merkel, I mean, I understand that Merkel's reaction in private to the revelations was much more muted than her reaction in public, whereas again with Brazil, the private reactions were as steamingly angry as the public reactions. But for Merkel, of course, she has, she has a much more sophisticated espionage operation herself, and the Brazilians don't. They're not great at this, I have to say. They have great hackers. Their state is very disorganized in this area. So that what Snowden and Greenwald were trying to do, as I understand it, was, and here they succeeded, was to get the people of Germany, the people of the European Union, pretty upset about what the NSA and GCHQ was doing. And particularly, I mean, there was one real moment where I was astonished about this, that the GCHQ had hacked into Belgacom, into one of the biggest telecom companies in Belgium, presumably on behalf of the United States. And so the GCHQ was hacking a major telecommunications company inside the EU, which I would have thought would have gone down very, very badly in presidential meetings. And so this was the aim of those revelations, was to take it away from the overall sort of civil rights things and actually to start creating political divisions.
Well, they
within.
succeeded. Wow. That's quite clear, and I think it benefited Russia because, well, given the close relations between Russia and Germany, well, to get this kind of information about Merkel, I think it was a real gift to Putin, because now he might rely on position of Germany and talks about how the internet should be governed, and I think it's quite an achievement.
That's right, because there is a lot of public pressure now in Germany that they move towards this. So what, again, to reiterate what Andrei was saying before the Snowden business came up, is that the Russians and the Chinese were pushing to start what I call the fragmentation of the internet into giant intranets, so that the state controls what comes in and out of your own particular intranet, and which to a large degree starts to defeat the point of the internet. And this is why Snowden has been so confusing. It's thrown the cards up in the air, and we still don't know exactly where they're going to fall. But Russia is making hay out of it. And I think at this point it's worth noting that the issue over internet regulation is one, as I said at the beginning, of 3 or 4 key issues, and we were talking about this before. In the great chess game of world politics, Russia knows that it's always black. It's never got the white side, but my God, it knows how to play the black pieces really, really well. That Putin has a very sort of lousy hand, but he's playing it incredibly well, and it's not just over the internet business. I see the Obama administration floundering about how to respond to this sort of thing. I don't see them coming up with any clear policy. There was the defensive Obama intervention about the NSA about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which was neither one thing nor the other. And Putin is very much in control of this aspect. And I think you can sort of see that a bit in Ukraine. You can certainly see it in Syria and the Middle East. Here is a country, Russia, which, is not one of the major drivers of the world economy. It has the gas, but that gas is being undermined by shale gas here. And its energy security is not as strong as it was, and its mid-term to long-term economic prospects are not brilliant, and yet it appears to be running rings diplomatically in most key areas of the world around the US and even the European Union, and perhaps in a little while we can talk about Ukraine in this context as well, which I think is very interesting. How does it look like from Moscow? I mean, from your perspective, not necessarily from the regime's perspective. Do you think that he's playing, in diplomatic terms, he's playing a really smart game at the moment, or is the opposition simply too weak?
Well, maybe both things. The opposition is...
I mean the opposition. I mean the diplomatic opposition.
The opposition,
in terms of the United States.
Well, I think. It's not only about. Well, I think that they play a very smart game, especially if you're looking into propaganda efforts. For example, I never expected when RT was launched that it might be successful. It was so straightforward. All these conspiracy theories.
Do we all know what RT is?
It's Russia Today.
Russia Today.
And all these propaganda outlets like Voice of Russia in English or Russia Beyond the Borders, all these strange publications meant to promote the Russian image abroad. I thought it would be a spectacular failure because, it used to be not very effective in the Soviet times and for everybody in Moscow. Well, I started my well, I started to work as a journalist in 1996, and I well remember that then, for liberal new publications to hire people from these propaganda outlets was just out of question, because these people were considered to be absolutely unprofessional. But instead we got something absolutely opposite. We got that now RT is the 4th popular TV station in Britain. I think it's quite popular even here. And
it's very, very popular on the internet as well,
yeah,
on YouTube.
They might be they might occupy the first position, but and also as far as I see, for many human rights organizations in the States and in Britain particularly, it's a big temptation, because they are tempted to go to RT, and they are given more space, more time to criticize their respective governments, and they are deprived of the same time on BBC or CBS, etc.
But I can tell you also, Andrei, I mean, from personal experience, that Russia Today in London is a pretty professional outlet, and it's, you know, it's not simple, you know, Soviet-style propaganda at all. You go in there, they ring you up, they have proper producers who will run through the questions that are going to go, you know, what the discussion's going to be like, and so on. It's like any other television station, and when you go on, it's not, you know, sort of saying, oh, America's bad, Russia good, and stuff like that at all. You can have a very, very varied discussion, including criticizing Russia. You know, it's not excluded. They've learnt that the kind of bald propaganda doesn't always work.
Russia Today in New York isn't quite so sophisticated.
Isn't it?
No.
Sorry about that.
But that might...
Well, it's much better. In the UK, it really is. I mean, it's like, you know, it's widely watched, and it's not bad. It has one or two bad ones on it, but I won't go into it.
And we try to update this system right now. We just disbanded RIA Novosti and try to combine all these outlets in one big body. And, well, I think, well, again, Putin pronounced, and his people just announced this idea that Russia would be a leader in world conservatism. And, well, firstly, I was just struck by this, well, the vagueness of this idea, that it might be quite strange, because we well remember from our history textbooks that in the 19th century Russia was already a leader in something like that, and then it was called a European policeman, as far as I remember. And I don't think it's a very good comparison, but anyway, I think that might be successful given the Olympics. Getting back to Sochi.
Yes.
The whole Sochi project was meant to improve Russian.
What's the intention with Sochi? What is Putin aiming to do?
To send a message that Russia is back, that Russia is once again it's a world power. This kind of thing was actually tried by Russian authorities maybe over the last 3 years. I think the most spectacular example is how different was coverage in the United States and in Russia of the scandals about illegals caught in the United States in 2010. You remember that here in the United States it was mostly viewed by publications like, well, a disaster. These people were failed to gather any significant intelligence. They just were caught by FBI. They just failed. In Russia, the same story was presented as the biggest success of Russian intelligence, because we showed to the world and to the United States that we can send people to the United States and we can succeed. So we are again back. We are second world power. And for many, it was accepted as quite a true idea of this competition.
There was an interesting thing which people didn't pick up of. The last person to be arrested in the spy roundup, who was arrested, I think, about 4 or 5 months after everyone else, as a sleeper, was working at Microsoft in Seattle. And that was the most interesting arrest of all, as far as I was concerned, because that means that, you know, they've not only got spies who were working as real estate agents in New Jersey, but they've got people who are working at the very heart of telecommunications inside the United States. So they're not, you know, these are serious long-term operations that they're involved in. And how successful do you think the Sochi Olympics. You know, it's not just for the United States and Western Europe. You know, I said to you earlier on, let's leave aside who hasn't gone to the opening ceremony and see who has gone. Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey was there, and you know his relationship with Putin is getting better and better all the time, and Xi Jinping as well.
Yeah.
So you know, this is no longer a world where it necessarily matters if you have low-level representation from the European Union and the United States. You're still showing all sorts of other people how powerful you are. So. You know, it looks to me as though, apart from the snowflake which failed to open on the first day, which everyone, I noticed in Western Europe and the US made a big deal of, I don't think it was made a big deal of elsewhere. And it looks to me, as a propaganda exercise, to have been pretty successful.
I should agree, and especially inside of the country.
And then there's the domestic aspect, which I want to ask
well,
you.
Domestic aspect is quite interesting. You know, that's quite. I think it's quite interesting thing that patriotism is a very important thing for the middle classes, not for communists or for people who retired even in the Soviet times, but for the middle classes. The middle classes became patriotic-minded maybe in the late 1990s, firstly because of the economic crisis of the 1998. Since then, they feel betrayed by the West, and this feeling actually helped Putin to become more and more popular. And sometimes this very feeling helped him to get support in times of crisis. It helped him in time of the Second Chechen War, because the state media were quite skillful to show to the middle classes on Russian TV the hypocrisy of Western coverage of the Second Chechen War. And then, by 2008, when the middle classes became quite disappointed with Putin, we got Georgian War, and again, the state media understood that the best way is not to promote the Russian ideas about how this crisis should be solved, but just to show the Western coverage, BBC coverage, CNN coverage, and just to point to mistakes. And it's actually, and the middle classes became outraged again by Western hypocrisy. And the same thing happened now with Sochi. Before Sochi, you remember that there were some funny pictures about toilets and all this stuff about how hotels in Sochi are quite prepared and not prepared for the Olympics. And this story was used by the state-controlled media to show to the middle classes, again, this Western hypocrisy. Or maybe even it was used as a proof of Western conspiracy against Olympics. And I think Putin just yesterday made some remarks about that some countries tried to undermine the Olympics, but they succeeded. So in fact, what I see now in Russia, that we have divided society, and some liberal circles, they think that everything would be absolutely awful during the Olympics, but for the main part of the population, they got this proof about hypocrisy of the West. They got the proof that the Russian authorities might organize something so spectacular, and they are very happy with this image. And so I think it was a success.
And I think the way that he's thinking about it is he looks back over the past sort of 9 months or so. He thinks Snowden he's playing Snowden well. That's working in his favor. Syria showed the absolute unpreparedness, I thought, of the United States administration for dealing with this sort of question, and Lavrov and Putin came in and completely blindsided everyone with the offer on the chemical weapons, and that really showed that you were dealing with very, very smart characters. And now we've got Ukraine. And the interesting thing about Ukraine is that, you know, here in a way I think the EU as well has played into Russia's hands, and certainly backed up by the Americans, or as we now know from the Newland conversation independently. And I'll come to the Newland conversation because I think that was a very, very significant intervention, not for the obvious reason, is that on Ukraine, the EU was forcing Ukraine to say, you're either East or you're West. And you can't really do that with Ukraine. You're going to run into trouble if you do that, because a substantial part of Ukraine does not necessarily feel that it's West. What was interesting, of course, in the protests is there were a lot of protests in what were understood to be fairly sort of Sovietized, Russianized areas. So what were they protesting about? They weren't protesting saying we want to be part of the EU. They were protesting against the corruption of the Yanukovych regime, which has sprung all boundaries, even by Ukraine's impossible standards. And what we should have been doing, what the EU should have been doing, I would have thought, is to highlight that issue of corruption, rather than highlight the issue of either you come with us or you go with Russia, because that puts Ukraine in an impossible position. And for Putin and Lavrov, when they see that, it's an open goal for them to shoot into, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when they play also this nationalist card. They always try on Russian TV. You might see this footage about that the hardest protesters are presented by the nationalist organizations like private sector, and because of so many problems about nationalism in Russia, this subject is very resonant in Russia, and for many it's actually a big thing, because they think, well, the same problem we might got in Moscow during Moscow protests. And because some of Russian opposition leaders, they like to play with nationalists, so this idea seems to be very plausible for many. That well, you see this opposition try always to use nationalist feelings. They try their hand in Kiev. They would try the same argument as the same approach in Moscow. And because the middle classes in Moscow are so afraid of any violence, to be frank, I think Navalny, he destroyed himself just by one line when he said...
when was that?
It was at the Sakharov Prospect, and I think it was December. It was the main gathering of people. We got maybe 100,000 people. And Navalny was so fascinated that so many people come that he said I think it was a mistake, and maybe it's a crucial mistake of his career. He said, now we can go to Kremlin. And I just physically see how many people were set back by this thing, because Russian propaganda before that played the card about you might get the new revolution of the 1917. Your houses would be burned, your children would be killed, and all this stuff. And we need to avoid these things by all means. And then he lost the support of so many people. So this card is actually played all over the time, and it happened now with Ukraine.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about, I want to talk about the Newland business, and again, the way that Russia perceives things. Because if we leave out the comment about the EU, although I'll come back to that, because I think that's possibly been misinterpreted as well. What was really interesting is one listens to the whole conversation. What do you hear Victoria Newland say? She says, well, we need Yatsenyuk in there because Yatsenyuk understands the economy and he's sophisticated and so. And Klitsch, he'll just muck things up, and I don't think so. We don't want Klitsch in there, and this, and of course Putin is listening to this, and he's saying the Americans are there deciding who's going to be in the government or not.
Yeah, that's right.
And this, I think, the Russians. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm speculating. What the Russians don't mind people being nasty and hard, but they want to feel respected. And I just don't think when the Americans are sort of discussing, and we know the Russians are listening, obviously, we don't know for sure, although I'm told by my sources in the EU that it was released by the Russians, that they get very, very irritated by the United States discussing who's going to be in the Kiev government and who's not. And in terms of the European Union, well, first of all, what she was proposing was, instead of the EU taking the political lead, was the United Nations. And what do we all know about the United Nations as a sort of, political avant-garde? It's completely non-functioning and it doesn't work. So that, it was basically they wanted someone in there who was not going to, for whatever reason, who was not going to work. Now, the thing that I think that the EU and the United States fell out about temporarily, and we have to remember that this was a private conversation, and people in private conversations, bitch and make nasty remarks about their friends and allies all the time, and so I don't think one needs to exaggerate it. But there is a fundamental difference in terms of how the Americans and the EU want to respond to Ukraine, and that is the question of sanctions. The Americans are always keen to move to sanctions fairly quickly, and the EU's kind of terrified of sanctions. And that is a substantive disagreement that I think was behind that remark. Of course, again, for the Russians, it's, the two major Western allies are not even talking properly to each other. Ukraine is ours, basically. That's the way that I think that they're probably looking at it at the moment, and they haven't even had to do much except release one phone call.
Yeah, I don't think that Lavrov was really outraged by these things. He's too experienced, and of course he knows how things might be arranged. But I think that to channel this, to play on these feelings of. Oh, you're absolutely right. The feeling of respect for the Russians, for the Russian audience, is a very important thing. And when I spoke about this patriotism, it's mostly about respect. We need to be respected. We need to get back to be respected by the West once again. And I think this this conversation was used clearly to inflame these feelings among Russians. That you see that the Americans are so. Well, they just interfere in the affairs of our neighbors, and for many in Russia, and even on Russian state TV, it's still a question whether Ukraine is a real state. It was questioned by Mikhail Leontiev, who is quite a prominent, we might say, journalist on Russian First Channel, and he's now the main advisor to Rosneft. Anyway.
What might else we say? So I think, what we're coming to is we're coming to a bit of a conclusion before I think it's worth opening it up. And that is, what it seems to me is lacking is that. And the one country we haven't really talked about in terms of the relationship with Russia is Germany, and that's very, very, very important because Germany is always tempted by a close relationship with Russia, and the need for energy is obviously overriding in this as far as Berlin is concerned. But what I think we see is we do see, as an international player, Russia as being resurgent, and it's being allowed to be resurgent because, in particular, the United States is not formulating a coherent response. The reset policy, which the outgoing ambassador Michael McFaul was largely responsible for. Reset hasn't really happened as far as I can see, if we ever knew what reset would mean in concrete policy and diplomatic terms. And so, there's not much direction coming out of Washington, and this enables Russia really to punch above its weight. And it's doing that, I've got to say, I think pretty effectively.
Yeah, I think my main conclusion is that given Snowden's revelations and given how these arguments were already, these revelations were already exploited by the Russian authorities. I think that maybe in 2 years period we might get something completely different instead of the internet. And because now Russian position supported by Brazil, by Germany, and maybe by France next time. Nobody knows. By that might happen. Well, I think that we might. Well, it's what we also should remember that it's not only about the position of the totalitarian states to promote the idea of balkanization of the internet. It's also, in some ways, it's even supported by the global platforms themselves. They try to present us localized versions of a platforms. When I'm in Moscow, I go to Google.ru not because of the government pressure. I go to Google.ru because it's it's profitable for the Google. And the same thing happened with Twitter. Just remember the very first reaction of Twitter when we were asked by the Russian authorities to censor some of the tweets. They said, well, now we need to think about local versions of Twitter to different countries because we just tired of censoring all this stuff. And I think when you get things like authoritarian states and with the strategies of global platforms combined, to be frank, I'm very skeptical. I think there is no way to try to protect the internet in a way as it exists now.
There's just one thing that I would add on in terms of what I was summing up with, and that's the issue of the Russian economy. Is that it's, as far as I can see, in the midterm to long term at the moment, it's not going anywhere, and that Putin doesn't really have, he still relies on energy as the primary resource. He doesn't really have much of a strategy beyond that. It's not developing, and much as he's enjoying himself again as president. He still has the issue hanging over him of what happens after me, and will I ever get tired of this, and can I not enjoy some of the fruits of my labour over the past 20 years or so. So that in terms of how long can Russia punch above its weight, well, it can up to a point, but it's also got to deliver to ordinary Russians. And it's not got a great track record on that, I'd say.
Well, I think that's certainly there is a point in it. And just maybe we should remember one thing. Maybe the first thing was that was done by Putin when he came back to the presidency. He decided to extend the term for officials from 60 to 70. And this is a clear sign that actually, for Putin, it's a big problem where to find new people to replace his old guard. And well, it's a big problem for example, for security services, where to find new people, and it's already caused a big conflict between generations, because colonels were trying to wait when these old guys might be replaced, and they already are too old. They might be 65, 67. So what might be the next? And then Putin decided just to extend this term.
That's very interesting. And when did that happen, Andrei?
Well, just I think it was the very first degree he signed when he came back to presidency. So it's one thing, and the other thing that I think it's worth of investigation. I never tried to investigate it, but some of my friends from Western publications came to me maybe months ago and said something like, let's try to investigate children of all these oligarchs, of all these big officials, of all these big ministers. And what we understood after some, brief period of investigation, that actually these children, they don't represent a real Russian elite. Their parents, they still try to hold control over all these assets. And these children, they are not given the real positions where they can do something.
Right, they're just sort of enjoying the fruits of the wealth and spending it in nightclubs and on Ferraris and that sort of thing.
So what might happen if their parents actually they would be forced to retire? Nobody knows. So actually, I see the lack of direction, not only for the government, but even for these for generations of even for oligarchs.
Very interesting point.
Well, let's open it up for discussion, but I want to take the privilege of the chair to ask the first question, and I want to ask it of Andrei. We started talking about the possibility of a secession after Putin. You have great expertise in the security services in Russia, in addition to your expertise on information technology in particular. Can you imagine any situation where the FSB would no longer have power over people by its ability to collect compromising materials? What transitions us away from an FSB-dominated regime?
What you should remember about the FSB, that for so many years, FSB enjoyed this status of, they're absolutely, they're impenetrable for any kind of control, including control of the president. And they were given so much powers and so many privileges, and they enjoy this status of, and as a result, something happened with them. I think they're actually, maybe it's better to ask some people who are actually experts in bureaucracies, but as far as I understand, what happened with them is, as might happen with any bureaucracies in the world, when you have no control, you are not pressuring from outside, you become more and more passive. Because why you need to deal with all these, problems? It would be Putin's problems, not because they are granted with privileges. Why we need to think about threats to Putin's regime? And actually, that already happened in 2011, when we got first Moscow protest. Putin, first time maybe for many years, he openly criticized the FSB because the FSB failed to provide political analysis of the political situation in the country. And then we got the situation when the investigative committee became much more active in terms of prosecuting opposition, organizing all these court cases, and and now if you look into what is the major player in terms of repressions, it's not the FSB, it's the investigative committee. And maybe it's because, I explain these things by bureaucratic reasons. The investigative committee is the last security, I might say, service in the country, which is still led by the guy who actually built this agency. That's why he might rely on the people, because he chosen all these people personally.
Can you give us a brief history of the investigative committee?
The investigative committee was organized in 2007, firstly as a body within the General Prosecutor Office, and Putin named Bastrykin, who is still the chairman of the investigative committee. And so, as I said, he was in position to choose all his main people inside of the committee.
So he's personally invested in the...
Yes, that's why this agency is still, is more active, just because he might rely on these people, he trusts them. For the FSB, it's completely different, because they still have the problems that Bortnikov, who is the director of the FSB, he had these problems of trust with his immediate deputies, because he still has deputies appointed by his predecessor. And there is no way, in Russia, it's always we have this problem in Russian bureaucracy, there is no way how to promote new people and how to get rid of old people. That's why, you remember that maybe the only period of time in the Soviet history when we got people quickly promoted, it wasn't during the Stalinist purges, because people were just killed every few months or years. With Khrushchev, we got this stalemate in bureaucracy, and we still have this problem, even in security services.
So let's open it up. Does anybody know, do we have a microphone to pass around to people so that they can speak into it?
We can use the one on the podium.
Yeah, why don't we use one of these microphones? So we'll trust people to pass the microphone from one person to the next. Is there a hand for somebody who wants to speak up first?
Hi, my name is Catherine Fitzpatrick. I've always admired your work. I wanted to ask you about Edward Snowden. One is about WikiLeaks' operation in Russia. There's always been attention on Shamir, but in fact, the other outfit that's been close to Assange and has worked with Sarah Harrison for the years leading up to Snowden's arrival is Ruski Rapporteur.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what their role was, and I'm also wondering how secure Snowden's comms are, given the recent revelation that that we know that he used Tor and he used Tails, that there were malicious nodes found in Russia, 22 malicious nodes found in Russia in Tor, and that one of the attacks was made in Hong Kong when he was there. So this opens up the whole question of not that his files are literally on those laptops, which no one really thinks they are, but that his channel, he's talking to journalists daily, that could be a compromise. And just finally,
yeah.
who is the sponsor of Sarah Harrison? I mean, how did she get a visa?
Well, starting with WikiLeaks, I think WikiLeaks made a very strange choice when they chose Ruski Reporter as the main partner in Russia, because Ruski Reporter is pro-Kremlin, pro-government and publication, and very uncritical. And they were happy to publish stories about cables. But I was surprised that WikiLeaks decided to choose Ruski Reporter. As far as I know, mostly it was this choice was made because of Shamir, because Shamir is employed by Ruski Reporter. And well, you know this, surprisingly, but WikiLeaks and Assange personally had quite a good relations with Russian authorities, because he is present at RT, and personally I think that maybe he helped to arrange things for Snowden, because it was a very easy way to reach the Russian authorities and to talk about Snowden, and much easier for. And because actually WikiLeaks never tried to criticize the choice of that Snowden decided to go to Moscow, and they never tried to question his integrity in Moscow. So I think maybe it might be explained by the fact that actually Assange arranged some maybe first talks between the Russians and Snowden's team. And in terms of his communications, I think I'm not a security expert, but as far as I understand from my conversations with security experts, it's absolutely impossible to guarantee the security of your communications if the lines are controlled by security services. And because Snowden, he lives in a controlled environment, all his communication lines are controlled by the FSB. You might use all kinds of cryptography, but these kind of things cannot guarantee they could not be intercepted. Just because he cannot control his laptops 24 hours, 7 days in a week. It's just impossible. And so that I think basically might explain why he's in such a strange to me situation. And also I think that what was also quite interesting to me, that some months ago, Kucherian, his lawyer, who is very close to the FSB, and it's not just speculation, just because he's a member of the public council of the FSB, so it's quite clear. And Kucherian made the remark that Snowden would be given 5 years asylum in Moscow after this term would be expired, and there was no remarks from Snowden. I think it's.
So we have somebody now who will pass around the microphone and back. Are there other questions? Should we pass the microphone to someone else? Yes. Oh, okay. You can go first, that's fine.
Thank you. I guess what baffles me about the Victoria Nuland call and the supposed outrage over it is that, and maybe I've spent too much time in Washington or SIPA or wherever, but it doesn't seem shocking. It's people talking about how they would like the world to be shaped, which is exactly what world leaders do. And I guess my question is there something shocking that I'm missing, or is there something that should be insulting to Russia that I'm missing, other than that they want to be
No,
respected.
that's why I said, you know, that this is how people talk all the time, diplomats and so on. It was a private conversation, and you know, if you can't talk in that way as a diplomat, you can't move things forward. The point is it was released by whoever in public, and you know, the public is not used to diplomats using expletives in that way about, you know, your closest ally and that sort of thing. We all know that diplomats use expletives in that way every day, all the time, relentlessly. But it's the public nature of it, and that's the irony of, you know, of it being comms again. It's comms that you can't even, you know, clearly they're talking on, if not open lines, then semi-open lines, and you've just, you know, it's not their conversation that is intrinsically disturbing at all. It's the fact that it's been published and it is interpreted by publics in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union, and in the United States. That's the issue.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, because the same thing we got with Snowden's revelation. I think many things were known. No, I don't mean the names of concrete programs, PRISM and so on, but many things were known because of, thanks to James Bamford revelations in New York Times. But I think when Bamford published his stories and his books, excellent books, it was meant, well, not to general public, and general public, well, just don't care about these problems. And when we got Snowden, and immediately we found ourselves in the situation where general public is very concerned about privacy and about surveillance, and it's absolutely new thing for the authorities, I think, and not only for the American authorities, but for everybody.
Could I ask people when they're speaking to please identify themselves? So next, here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andrew Lawson. I'm a first-year CEPA student, focusing on political development. I'm curious, when we're talking about the intercept of the Victoria Nuland conversation, there's no mention that we haven't mentioned so far the Ukrainian security services. So I'm curious, is this seen as a purely Russian intercept? Is it a Russian intercept with Ukrainian support? And then more broadly, what do you see as a current direction of information sharing relationships between the Russian security services and the countries of the near abroad? Do you see this in terms of sharing information just directly? Are we seeing an increase in sharing information gathering technologies? And then is Russian legislation being kind of farmed out as sample legislation for other intelligence services to be considering for adoption as well?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, the problem is that we have SORM not only in Russia. This term is used in legislation of not only of Ukraine, but Belarus and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, as far as I remember. So it's still we still live in the countries where this legacy of Soviet secret services is very alive, and it's not only about terminology, but also about regulation. And the lawful interception in Ukraine is very similar to Russia, except one thing, is even more intrusive. That's quite surprising, but for example, in Russia, you cannot use SORM to interrupt the conversation. In Ukraine, it's possible. But when we are talking,
you mean by interrupt to cut the conversation?
Just
you were saying no, that's not true.
I think you might use both ways. But when we are talking about, when we use all these countries, we use this terminology and legislation which is quite similar to the Russian legislation. It means mostly that we can use also the Russian equipment, because the Russian equipment just fits into the system, and of course it opens excellent opportunities for the Russian secret services. Of course, we have some limitations, like we love to talk about the agreement of 1992, and this agreement was signed by all security services of the former Soviet Union, and it was something about we obliged not to spy on each other. The problem is that then this obligation from Russia was signed by the Foreign Intelligence Service, but not by the FSB. And that the situation completely changed by the early 2000s, and we found the evidence that the FSB built a special unit inside of the FSB which was charged to spy on immediate neighbors, mostly in the former Soviet Union, and now they added some other countries like Afghanistan. But anyway, and in 2010, a group of rebellious FSB officers posted online some documents of this very unit. And what was clear from these documents that at least one operation was organized by the FSB on Ukrainian soil, and the idea then was to undermine the relations between Ukraine and Kazakhstan. I think it was Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, sorry, and excuse me, Turkmenistan, of course. And the idea was to falsify the document that Ukrainian administration helped financially Turkmenistan opposition, and went to publish this document. What was quite hilarious about this story, that two documents was published. The first, it was a report to Putin that we accomplished our task, we published this document, blah, blah, blah. The second document was, we kindly request you to tell our colleagues at the Foreign Intelligence Service not to report this document as genuine. So actually, Foreign Intelligence Service collected this document somewhere, tried to present it to Putin as a sign that we can spy on in Ukraine and we can collect this kind of thing. So that's why Russian security services were in quite a strange situation in Ukraine. In the same simultaneously, we have the abilities to sell Russian equipment for telecommunication interception, and also they have the right and they have the special units to spy on Ukrainian soil.
Yes, in front here.
Good evening. My name's Luke Barnes. I'm a third-year undergrad, and I was just wondering your opinion. You mentioned, or previous speaker mentioned, Tor, the service, and I was wondering whether you think that the Snowden affair represents an opportunity for growth for services such as Tor, or do you think that in a wider scale and compared to the abilities of the Russian security services of the NSA, that they're somewhat gimmicky masking services, if that makes sense?
Well, certainly in the immediate wake of Snowden, when you had the first sort of avalanche of PRISM and that sort of thing, there was amongst the sort of free internet civic activists and amongst hackers, there was a huge move to try and come up with new technologies which would avoid detection. One of the most important revelations from Snowden, I think, was the amount of money, the amount of employees that the NSA is putting into breaking encryption. And that, I think, in the next 10 years is really one of the big tech stories, is until somebody is able to develop quantum encryption, I don't think it's going to be too long until most encryption systems are broken. But there is a battle going on out there of groups that are independent. They're not necessarily pro-Snowden, they're not necessarily criminal, they're not necessarily civic activists, but people who are determined to try and protect their communications for whatever reason. This is quite a lively area, and there have been a few people who've put in patents for new technology which is supposedly safe at the moment, but it hasn't yet come on the market, as I understand.
And I think also we are dealing with a big problem of trust even to these services like Tor, because while you remember that Tor and, for example, Siphon were funded by some government institutions. Tor was initially funded by, I think, by the military intelligence, by naval military intelligence, and for many, it's a big, still funded. Well, Siphon, great tool, but actually it was funded by by BBC to allow people in Central Asia to get access to, on their smartphones, to BBC broadcasting. So for many, it's a big question. Can we trust these VPN services? Because, well, the big question about VPN, that, well, it might be impenetrable for outsiders, but who controls data eventually? And I think that there's no answer.
Question in the back there.
Hey, Dorian Gagger, Graduate School of Journalism. I just had a question for you, Andrei. Kind of media related, a little bit off what we're kind of talking about, but I'm just kind of curious about two recent things. The liquidation of the RIA Novosti and the pressure by the Russian cable companies on independent broadcaster RAIN TV. And I'm just kind of curious how at all of these two events are connected. I mean, there was minimal independent reporting before this. So I guess I just kind of have two questions. What changes do you think can be expected with the elimination of RAIN from cable carriers and the new arrangements for RIA Novosti? And as well, do you think it's coincidence that these changes are happening at the time of Sochi, or they just kind of play into the bigger picture of the Sochi story?
I think it's hardly a coincidence. I think in Russia we see well, for many years we see these two approaches, very straightforward approaches, mostly represented by Siloviki, by security services, and some other people in the administration, and more sophisticated approach to play with some liberals and to try to present to the West more, well, the picture of a more civilized Russia. And the RIA Novosti was a part of the second approach. The idea was to collect some people, maybe, well, in some way they were more liberal than what you might expect from people funded by the Kremlin. And it was, to be frank, this game we saw for many years, because in the Soviet time, APN, which was actually the predecessor of RIA Novosti, that was the place when where most liberal-minded journalists worked in the time of the Soviet Union, because it was the only place where this kind of thing might be allowed. And the same thing happened with RAIN TV, because that was the initiative of Medvedev and of his people to support this kind of liberal platform for the middle classes, because it might help them to play this game of and to use this more sophisticated, more complicated approach. But when we got the change of government, we got the change of people inside of the administration of the president, and many experts think now that it's this approach now we deal with completely new approach. It is absolutely different. It's much more straightforward, and in a way it might be more primitive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not so efficient. It might be even more efficient. Now they just don't think that we need to play this game with liberals. We can't forget about them completely, because they don't matter. Why to support this independent TV channel? If it would be closed down, what might happen? Nothing. We already have this situation of apathy among the middle classes in Moscow. Everybody understood that for a while, for some years, the opposition movement in Russia is finished. There is no way to build a new party or new trade unions or new movement. It's just impossible, because everybody quite disappointed. So why to maintain this with strange ideas of liberal journalists funded by people close to the government? And I think, I think it might be connected with Sochi, because before Sochi, many Russian officials they stated that Sochi would help to promote the new image of Russia. And when RIA Novosti was disbanded, the first comment from Russian officials was just the same, that we need to work on the new image of Russia and to work more, to try to combine all government-funded medias into one body, and then to try to address the Western audience in a more sophisticated way. So I think these things might be connected.
Question here.
Thank you. Dario Cepa, Fulbright Scholar at Harriman Institute. If we can go back to the opening ceremony of the Sochi Olympics, you mentioned who came to the opening ceremony, but should maybe an interesting point be made in how many of them came? Not only in Russia showing to the US that they still are the second world power, but Russia showing to China that they still are second world power, so that China doesn't need to butt in their territory, meaning that they can still, despite this being smaller Olympics than the 2008 Beijing summer ones, that they still can get these many world leaders or state leaders to come to their bidding. Thank you.
I honestly don't think that China would consider Russia to be the second world power.
Yeah, I doubt it.
And I think in their heart of hearts, a lot of Russian officials would probably concede that point as well. But there is a deepening relationship between Russia and China at the moment, based both on strategic interests but also increasingly economic interests as well. Trade between Russia and China is increasing quite dramatically year on year, and there are certain sectors like, just one that I've read about recently, which is the arms trade, where Russia is really doing very well selling into China.
No.
And China is very happy to take Russian material. So at the moment, it's one of those phases. I mean, the Russian-Chinese relationship, like most, have always sort of, gone. But I think at the moment that it's sort of like that.
And I think that, to be frank, that Russia now tried to please China, not China tried to please Russia, especially in terms of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all talks about Afghanistan, and even if we are talking about surveillance things, well, remember that some months ago, you remember this scandal about Huawei. It happened in the United States and happened in Britain, and when Russian Rostelecom decided to acquire Huawei equipment to introduce DPI on nationwide basis on mobile networks owned by Rostelecom, and well, some FSB officers were not very happy with Huawei equipment because, well, of course they thought about, well, they might be spied on now by Chinese, but they were told by the seniors to forget about this question because we need to please the Chinese. So this is a game.
There's a question here in the middle.
Ilya Zaslavsky, oil and gas consultant, and Robert Bosch, fellow at Chatham House. I have two questions. One is, can we make any definitive conclusions on whether you mentioned that increasingly FSB officials have been caught promoting their own private interests, not supporting, serving Putin or regime. So can we make any definitive conclusions whether there is large-scale employment of KGB methods for private business abroad, for FSB officials, or for employing methods of KGB in business? Or, for example, this thought has passed recently in a book by James Sher, Soft Power of Russia. I can't remember the exact title. And second question related to it. Can we make any? Can we have any conclusions on who actually owns? Can we claim that FSB owns major assets in Russia? FSB security people, because if we look at Russian Forbes list, for example, the majority of people there are not with security background. Yes, we have hired managers, but and also, what is it? Owning, controlling, and or benefiting. I guess this is not a market economy, and so this should be explained. Thank you.
Well, the biggest problem with the FSB and the KGB is, well, you just need to remember how these people are trained. They are not trained in a way the MI6 people are trained, or well, CIA people. They studied 5 years courses at the special academy. It means they live in barracks, literally. And for many of them, security services is a family business. As a result, they have a very special kind of mentality. They got used to live in a closed, controlled environment. They believe in and all these things about generals and colonels and who is a senior. And for that, it means that when we got with New Times in the 1990s, the people from the KGB were not extremely successful in business. And that's why they were mostly hired as people responsible for security by oligarchs. But I don't remember even one oligarch who actually had origins inside of the KGB. We have the example of Alexander Lebedev, but he was always a small fish. He was within, well, quite close to Gazprom, and he was allowed to make some money. But he was not, well, he was not comparable with Khodorkovsky, Smolensky, Gusinsky, and with...
How do you believe Timchenko? That's the only thing.
Well, Timchenko, well, I don't think that's... well, actually, his KGB background is very questionable, at the very least. So I think that, and even in terms of methods, these people know how to exploit their connections inside of security services. But in terms of how to play this game in the West, I don't think they're very skillful. I don't think it might be, well, they might be effective here. Because well, you just need to remember one point, and to be frank, I picked up this point from your book, that mafia, that in the 1990s, it was not the idea of mafia, but it was the idea of business to use mafia as a force that might solve the problems, the disputes between businesses. And then the same people, the same businessmen, they just wanted to use not mafia, but the FSB to solve their problems. So that's why this system in Russia is so effective. But, well, in the West, because the system is different, so how these people might use their connections? I don't think so.
No. I thought it was very interesting indeed. But I would say that you know, the oligarchs tend to be the oligarchs and have remained so. I mean, the differentiation, it seems to me, was always which oligarchs were able to strike deals with Putin and which oligarchs were not, and decided to move all their operations out of Russia. I mean, one thing that I would say is one person we haven't mentioned here is Khodorkovsky, and this I find absolutely fascinating, because if Khodorkovsky had been released 2 or 3 years ago, he would have been all over the New York Times and the Guardian and everyone. And actually, he's come out and there's barely been a murmur. He's, you know, he's not putting himself out there very much, and there's very little coverage of him here in the US, very little coverage of him there in Europe. You know, the oligarchs, it seems to me, are very well and successfully controlled by Putin in a variety of different ways. And I never anticipated, I must say, I never anticipated him releasing Khodorkovsky, but it looks to me as though, you know, as a political threat to Putin for the moment, certainly, he's neutralized.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are certainly people who appear to have KGB histories who have gotten wealthy, even if they are not at the level of the oligarchs.
Yeah, sure.
That's absolutely right. And there was you know, in the 1990s, there was a melding together of KGB personnel and oligarchs, and indeed organized criminal figures. And you know, I mean, Lebedev himself, you know, he's not uninfluential. His son is the sort of, you know, celebrity star of every London glamorous event you can imagine, and they've still got a lot of money to throw around. And he controls media in the United Kingdom, you know, and that's so. Yes, I mean, you know, but he's fallen out with most of his KGB friends, and so maybe he's not representative. But clearly, the KGB was involved in the whole project of what I refer to as gangster capitalism, in a big way.
Other questions? Yes, over on the left.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming to speak and spending your night at us. My name is Christia. I'm a SIPA student. And my question is towards your opinion on the prospects of rising computer security companies such as Kaspersky Labs and being able to successfully operate without any interference or influence by the Russian government.
Well, I've got to say, Andrea and I were having breakfast this morning in our hotel, and I have my computer because I was taking notes, and I had my email up, and this email dropped. I get sent endless PR emails from companies representing security firms, and this one came down saying Kaspersky appoints its international board.
Yeah.
And I looked at the international board.
Yeah,
and
it's amazing.
It's astonishing. It's got Bruce Schneier in it, who is a very, very influential character, who's the head of security at BT. He's an American. And above all else, eyes out on stalks, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, former Minister of Security and sort of chief spook in Cameron's first government. And she's not a spook herself, I listened to her, but she had close relations with and for her to be on Kaspersky's board is just, I'm still trying to still trying to work out what this all means. But you know, Kaspersky's he's a fascinating character. He really is a fascinating character, both in terms of his ability, the sort of, you know, the areas that you don't quite know about him, although Andrei knows more than most people do. But also, you know, it is fascinating that the best antivirus company in the world, in terms of its product, is every year it's Kaspersky every time. It's really it's very, very striking. And of course, some people have observed to me, I couldn't possibly comment, that it was possibly not a coincidence that when it came to revelations about Stuxnet and Duka and so on, that it came out of Kaspersky's labs.
Well, in terms of closeness of such companies to the Russian secret services, I should say it's not, well, they're not unique. For example, we have this IB group, and they are very close to the FSB, and we like to say that they investigate crimes under orders, or maybe under request of the FSB. And I think we need to put this problem into larger context. You need to remember that in the Soviet times, we used to have the largest engineer community in the world. And Russian engineers, Russian technical intelligentsia, was always very close to the state, and specifically to the military-industrial complex. They never had any problems with moral problems of working for arms project or for working for the KGB, because many Russian technical projects were actually funded by the security services. And just to give you one example, and love this example, is example of the company which produced now the best speaker recognition technologies in the world. This company is now based in St. Petersburg, and they were able to sell their systems to Mexico, to Ecuador, to Colombia, to some Middle Eastern countries. And they are proud to be the direct successors of Sharashka, where Solzhenitsyn was imprisoned and was forced to walk. And they're proud of this fact. They are still close to they used to be close to the NKVD and KGB, they're still close to the FSB, and they're proud of it. And I think the problem is that the training our engineers get, and I think it's mostly about technical skills. It's not about real university education. And so when we did our research about Russian surveillance technologies, I tried to approach these people, asking them some basic questions about what you think about what your technologies might be used in countries to persecute people. And they always told me the same thing, something like, well, we cannot be responsible for how our technologies might be used. You never try to criticize the guy who produces the knife and all this stuff. So it seems that for many of them, they never try to question and to ask questions themselves about morality of these things. Just because they lack this kind of training, they were never educated in this way.
And let's remember, whether we're talking about Russia, whether we're talking about China, or whether we're talking about the United States, in terms of new technology, the military is always playing a critical role. I mean, if you look at the iPhone, many of the critical technologies in the iPhone were not invented by Steve Jobs and his band of merry people. They came out of DARPA research programs, which were then fed into Apple. And in fact, there's a very convincing case to show that there's a lot about Silicon Valley, which is in fact state subsidized de facto, because the initial research is simply too expensive to go into for private companies, and so it's DARPA and other parts of the military who are doing this, and so it's a reality wherever you are that the military is playing a critical role. But it was one thing that what Andrei was saying reminded me of is when I was researching dark market, is that one of the most important rings of Russian hackers who were based in and around St. Petersburg were actually the young offspring of Russian-speaking engineers who had been working on nuclear projects in the closed city of Saaremaa in Estonia. And when 1990 happened, Saaremaa collapsed, you lose all the subsidies, the whole infrastructure goes with it, and what you have is these young children of very bright scientists, and they have no way of earning money, but they're very quick to learn how to hack. And so you saw in Russia and elsewhere that some of the clustering, this happened in Bulgaria as well, of criminal hacking activity came out of those areas where you'd had intense state subsidies beforehand, particularly looking at the science and the scientific and arms industries.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
So,
wait for the microphone. No, we need it for the recording. Thanks.
Lena Leon, specializing in cybersecurity. So in comparison with what you were just saying about these children, these genius children in growth, you mentioned before, I think Andrei you did, about oligarchs' children currently just enjoying the fruits of their parents' labor and not really currently being trained for their future task in the society. Correct me if you have a different opinion about this, but their parents weren't trained either. They were, in my opinion, they just stumbled upon their positions because somebody said, well, you'll be the leader of this industry and you'll be the leader of that specific. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that their children are not any different in how they're going to someday be told to, I don't know, lead one or another part of the industry. Well, I mean, I just would like more elaboration on that subject of how you see this going forward.
Well, you might be right about some state-controlled industries like transport industry, like railways. But if you look into the list of the main oligarchs, and we actually, despite all things that happened with Putin, we have the same list of people, like Oleg Perov. Well, actually, if you look into oil industry specifically, you might find that, and into metal things like Bazov Element and Rusal, and we still have the same people which became prominent in the 1990s. And these people actually they made their own careers and they are self-made men. And I don't think it might go with children. It's absolutely different situation.
Yeah, no, they were very smart, very hard-working. It was a time of transition. They seized the opportunity, and they became fantastically wealthy in a very short space of time. Now, what you can see is a sort of Buddenbrooks-type trajectory of the subsequent generations then squandering the great empires that had been built up. And I think actually, in terms of the oligarchs, it'll happen quicker than it did in Buddenbrooks, which I think was over an 85-year period. This is probably going to happen in a 20-year period, and you can see it, or you can see it already. Believe you me, in London, you can see it wherever you go. That they are just spending money like water on ludicrous vanity projects. And the fathers, and I use the gender advisedly in almost every case, the fathers are simply focused on running these incredibly vast, complex empires that they created during the 1990s. And so I don't think it fell into their laps at all.
Yeah, I agree.
They were connected, but they took the opportunity.
They took they were connected, although sometimes they were, I mean, you know, Berezovsky, you know, working away as a professor at a little maths institute.
He was not a part of the elite. He was just.
He was not part of the. He was not part of the elite, and you know, and nor a bunch of the others either.
Abramovich was absolutely nothing.
He was nothing. And look at the aluminum industry. You know, wow.
Oh yeah.
Those guys. So I think we can safely say on the biographies of some of the key oligarchs that they understood that this was a moment in history where if you played your cards right, you could get rich very, very quickly and very suddenly.
Well, thank you all. Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for this evening.